Hello and welcome to our viewers in Nigeria and around the world. This is People, Politics and Power. I am Mimonia Marere. Today we turn our attention to the over a decade-old crisis in the northeast of Nigeria. We shall examine the socio-economic and human cost of the crisis in that region. According to the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, which has just released a report of a study it conducted on the devastating impact of the conflict, violence and grave violations against children have led to a dire economic downturn, which is affecting not just the conflicted region, but the whole of Nigeria. The UNICEF study reveals that as of 2021, the Nigerian economy contracted by 2.5% than it would have been without the conflict, representing a cumulative loss of about $100 billion over the last 13 years. In addition, over 2.6 million people are currently displaced internally, while the education of about 1 million children has been disrupted and their basic rights violated due to the armed conflict. Indeed, some of them have been recruited and used by armed groups and deprived not just of an education, but also of their dignity, their health, and their childhood. UNICEF says these are tragic losses that cannot be guaranteed or quantified in monetary terms. The study also suggests that the effect of this drawn-out conflict may inhibit the Nigerian economy from achieving its full potential, thereby putting the country's future prosperity in serious jeopardy. This is exemplified by the loss of livelihoods and damaged infrastructure. There is no doubt that the study seeks to help our understanding of the larger impact of the conflict. But what economic model was used in measuring the impact of the conflict? What changes can the content of this report help to bring about? Who is it directed at? Who is it made for? And who is expected to take action to remedy the grave violations of the rights of children and youth, as well as the effects on the social welfare system? Now, what is the role of the international community in resolving the challenges identified in the report beyond humanitarian aid and donations? Right? We have joining us right here in the studios one of the authors of the report to give us more insight into the work that they have done at UNICEF. I'm joined by Mr. Patrick Kwame Amihere. He's a child protection specialist at UNICEF. Thank you so much, Mr. Kwame.
Thank you
for
very
finding
much.
time to
Thank
join
you
us.
for having me.
All right. Now, before we go into our discussion, let's listen to the UNICEF representative in Nigeria, Christian Muduate, at the launch of the report just a few days ago.
This UNICEF report reveals a harsh truth. The Nigerian economy as of 2021 was 2.5% smaller than it would have been without the conflict. And this is something that needs to be present in the considerations and the decision-making of the nation. This translates to a cumulative loss of $100 billion. It's way too much. But beyond these enormous figures, it also lies stories of shattering lives, of broken families, and of lost opportunities. And perhaps The most heartbreaking aspect of this study is the impact on our children. So in 2021, there was an estimate of 1 million children who missed schooling due to the conflict. Around 900,000 children were reported to suffer malnutrition and close to 300,000 with acute malnutrition. This in a country that is rich with culture, resources, and potential. So this gives us the idea of moving forward for making concrete actions to allow our children a better future, the country a better future.
As much as the people who suffer from conflict are the primary victims, the cost of conflict is borne by everyone. And that is because the death and destruction, the disruption of livelihoods and displacement that goes with conflict leads to lost growth and development opportunities. And that's what, as economists, we try and quantify. How much worse is Nigeria off as a whole compared to a world in which the conflict did not take place? Lost opportunities are often hard to spot, but we believe that by quantifying them, we can draw attention to the true costs of conflict that are borne by everyone. How do we measure the costs of conflict in terms of growth and development? And we used gross domestic product, which is the value of all goods and services produced in a particular year, as a measure of the effects of conflict. It's an imperfect measure, as I will explain, but it does capture some of the costs of conflict.
Right there you had the UNICEF representative in Nigeria, Christian Bonduate, and who was also joined by one of the authors of that report, Amar Breckenbridge, who was in fact the lead researcher of that study and the report that was extracted from that study. Well, here in the studio, I have with me Mr. Patrick Kwame Amihere, who is the Child Protection Specialist, UNICEF. He was not one of the writers of this report, but he's very well seized of the issues in this report. Mr. Ibrahim Sise, who is the Child Protection Specialist in UNICEF himself, would have joined us, but at the last minute, he had other engagements. So, Mr. Patrick Kwame Amihere, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Right. Okay, now let's delve into this. What informed the decision to carry out this study in the first place? Because this is a conflict that has been on since 2009, 2010, occasioned by, of course, the insurgency in the Northeast. Yes. I know that a number of reports on the insurgency and the economic impact have been made, have been written, and research papers have been published on this, but this is coming from UNICEF, yes, but with, of course, special focus on the plight of children. Yes. So what informed this study?
Thank you very much, and welcome, viewers. Like you rightly mentioned, there's been quite a lot of studies, mostly on social issues, economic issues, and security issues affecting that part of the country, specifically the Northeast. But very little has been done to quantify in monetary terms what the conflict presents, especially to children. And in this case, children who are in dire need of all these social issues and social services in the Northeast. And so that was the main push, because we thought to understand the conflict better and to see the relationship between the conflict and children, we needed to know how much, whether in Naira terms or in dollar terms, this conflict is affecting the children directly. And that is what informed the decision to carry out this study. Of
course, as we all know, conflicts of this nature, anywhere around the world, the children and women are most affected. Well, it appears that women are excluded from this report. Why so? Why is the target only on the children and perhaps young people?
Well, women are not entirely excluded in this report. You know, there is always a trickling effect. And when you talk about children, implicitly you're also referring to their mothers and their caregivers, which most of the times are women. But you know UNICEF's focus, and UNICEF focus is traditionally to address issues of children, but then also of women when you look at all those parameters around nutrition and breastfeeding and things like that. But it did not completely rule out the issue of women and others. Because when you look at GDP, we look at growth, we look at economics, it does not only affect children. But of course, in a study like this, we had to narrow it down and be very specific, because most of the times, violations, especially grave violations, are targeted at children. And we wanted to see how this, in the end, in monetary terms, affects these children. So if you look deep into the report, you see the bits on social issues like education, and how education, in turn, is being affected by the conflict, and what monetary terms is associated with that impact. Yeah, so that was the focus. We had to narrow it down, dovetail it down to a very targeted group. Who knows, there might be another study that addresses men, women, the elderly. But for this study, we had a focus, and the focus was, let's see how we narrow it down to the issue of children.
This report talks about the economic cost of the conflict in the northeast of Nigeria. How many states of the northeast or did this report or did this study cover?
Well, when we talk about the conflict-affected states in the northeast, we're basically looking at Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, right?
Three.
So those are the three main conflict-affected states that this report looked at.
It excluded the other states of the northeast.
Yes, because also if you look at our operations, and if you look at the map of northeast, when we talk about the base states where the conflict is localized, it's mainly Adamawa, Yobe, and Borno. And so we thought we also have to be very careful not to go beyond the scope of the report, but focus it on the conflict, on the main conflict-affected states. And this is conflict that is also being reviewed, conflict that is being reported against by the Security Council, by the Secretary General of the United Nations through the Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. So anything that happens outside that scope, whilst it is relevant, and whilst we also address them, but for this study, we had to be focused on the three main conflict-affected states.
The study didn't consider the fact that there could have been spillovers into other northeast states like Bauchi, like Gombe, for instance. These are contiguous states to these three main theater of the conflict.
Now, the study did not single out those states. But as you know, the study is looking at the impact of this conflict on the GDP, on the economic growth of this country. And so by referring to that, it would then encompass all of these, like you say, these other states that are either bordering or that are in the northeast. But if you look at the study in itself, its focus, like I said, is Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe. But it also looks at how it impacts economics. And the economics is not just for Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, economics of the country as well. Because GDP is not just linked to the GDP of Borno or the GDP of Yobe, but the GDP of the country.
Now, but going by this study, which of these three states, Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa, are is most impacted?
I would say Borno State. If you look at the report itself, Borno State.
Okay. Yeah. Now lead us into this report and tell us a little bit more of how this conflict has really impacted these states, their economy, the livelihoods of people, the entire gamut of human existence in these areas.
Yeah. Thank you. So this report, first of all, I will look at the model that it looked at. There are two key models here, the counterfactual model, but also the economic metric model. Now, the counterfactual model is basically saying in an ideal situation where there's no conflict, what will have been the growth? So let's say there's no conflict in the Northeast, there's no conflict in Nigeria. What will Nigeria's GDP will have looked like? But in a situation in Northeast, we can't use that kind of model because the conflict already exists. So we have to look at an econometric model that addresses national GDP and take that into consideration and say that, okay, if this was not happening, this country's GDP will have grown by X number. Why is it important? It's important because it shouldn't be business as usual. It shouldn't be business as usual of just providing services, but not able to understand exactly how these services are being, first of all, accounted for, but also, most importantly, how much the country is losing if this conflict did not exist. You know, you mentioned about what is expected. What is expected is that it's not just a report that should be shelved. And it should not just be a report that looks at numbers. It's not just a report that looks at dollars or naira. It's a report that should look at what is the impact per child, because every data represents a child. And every data represents a child that has not been able to go to school because of the conflict. Every data represents a child that is not able to access certain social services because of the conflict. I tell you, there are locations in the Northeast where a lot of children are not able to access education because of insecurity. And that it doesn't take any rocket scientist to know that with what is happening, what is prevailing in the Northeast, certain social services will be disrupted. Now, who should take the action? Who should take the action? It's a very big question, a very big ask. I think it has to be a collective responsibility from the government, both at federal and state level. Of course, you know, donor community, United Nations, we always support. We support the efforts, but the primary drivers here should be the government at federal and state level. Resource allocation, trying to end the conflict. Trying to end the conflict should not just be in abstract terms, but it should be, there should be an approach that demonstrates a lot of commitments on my side, on your side, on the side of the community, and side of the local government, state government, as well as federal government. So it's a collective responsibility of all the parties involved.
Before we go into the other issues of who should take responsibility, who should do what, and who is doing what, let's look at some of the figures that this report has put out there. The impact of the conflict, that's on page 8 of the report,
yes,
which talks about deaths and injury, displacements of both adults and children. It talks about nutrition and school enrollment, yes, which the report says decreased significantly between 2013 and 2019. Perhaps let's start from there. School enrollment, which, as you have said, between 2013 and 2018, primary school enrollment decreased by 6.66%, while that for secondary decreased by 12.69%. What was responsible primarily for this? Was it attacks on educational institutions, or indeed the disruption of lives of the people and the children in these locations?
I think you have partly made my life easy by answering some of the questions. But you know, it's a mix of so many things, and some of which you have highlighted. Insecurity plays a very major role in preventing children from going to school. You know what happened in Chibok some years back? What happened when all these kids were taken from their what they consider to be their safe environment. Now, this in itself poses a lot of social issues whereby families feel, if I send my kid to school, X is going to happen. But most importantly, the decrease in school enrollment was primarily because some locations were inaccessible. It is not because the state government were not willing and ready to invest in education. The last meeting we had with Ambassador Adamu Abbas, who is the executive in the Bono governor's office, he made it very clear that even if you plant X number of schools in Y community that is insecure, that is inaccessible, you just be putting a very nice building or nice structure in a location where it will not be useful. So insecurity is a major factor. Second one is also the social and economic strength and support that these people do not have. They've been displaced most of the time. Their social issues and livelihood support has been paralyzed. Most of them rely on humanitarian aid and support for sustenance and for livelihood. And so that in itself becomes a challenge. I think another issue is that the fact that most of these children, they ask themselves, go to school and then what? If I'm not able to go to primary 7 or go to Form 1, why don't I learn a trade? Why don't I learn something? Why don't I go into economic activities? But those are side parameters. The main parameters here is one, the insecurity, which leads to inaccessibility, but then also the fact that schools that are supposed to be very safe at some point within the bracket that we're talking about was a safe haven for people for armed groups to kidnap children. Now that said, I know Nigeria has been very, very strong in promoting the Safe School Declaration. In fact, one of the biggest Safe School Declaration conference was held in Nigeria. And that is very positive. But you see, what obtains on the ground is different from having very nice policies, very nice documents, very nice programs. If you can't access those locations, if the people don't feel safe, if the infrastructure does not exist, it becomes a challenge. And I think those were some of the reasons that were responsible for the reduction in enrollment within this bracket. Now, having said that, I want to say that the state government is doing a lot in trying to reverse this. And hopefully when the next evaluation,
when you talk about state government, are you talking about state governments? Because there are 3 states involved here now. Yes.
The Bono,
all 3 states, are they the ones you are referring to, or you are referring to one of the 3?
No, I'm referring to all. I mean, it's good to recognize positive commitments and efforts. And I think on this note, we have a very strong collaboration with all the 3 states' governments, and efforts are being taken to address some of this. Hopefully, when the next study is out, which focuses on some of these social issues, education, and the enrollment of children will have increased. Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the other figures that you have here. In terms of displacement, the report says that as of 2021, 2.6 million people were internally displaced in the Northeast. And I want to believe that this is limited to the 3 states that have been studied. But of this number, you have a situation where 2,205 children were killed during that same period. 1,209 of them were killed, and 996 were maimed. Yeah. That's between 2017 and 2021. This was at a period when the intensity of the conflict had, in a way, reduced from what it was at the initial stages, in the initial years of this conflict. And I'm just wondering what steps have been taken either by government or by an agency like the UNICEF or other UN agencies and other INGOs, because the Northeast is swarming with INGOs. Maiduguri has almost become the headquarters of INGOs in Nigeria. Almost every INGO has an office or has an operational base in the Northeast as we speak today. Mm-hmm. So what have all of these groups done to assist these people, these children, mm-hmm. these internally displaced persons, mm-hmm. to get back their lives and their livelihoods?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a very dire situation, and I like the way you have analyzed it. Well, yeah, Maiduguri has a lot of INGOs for obvious reasons. The challenges are not just Maiduguri, I mean the Northeast. The challenges are enormous, and I think we should appreciate what each and every NGO, whether national, international, community-based, are doing. But back to the crux of the matter. These figures, in my view, do not even represent the real situation. These are documented, verified figures. So if I take, for instance, the data on children killed and maimed between this period, you will agree with me that within this period, 2017 to 2021, there were still locations where no INGO, no agency was able to visit. And so we have not been able to capture those children that fall within accessible locations. But these figures are verified figures by the United Nations, especially on children killed and children maimed, and they are public in the report of the Secretary General on children and armed conflict. What are we doing? Children maimed require support, basically health-related support, psychosocial services, to make sure that the issue of trauma is addressed. IDPs receive support primarily within the camp environment. So you probably know that a lot of camps dotted around Borno and other states. But this camps, whilst we do not necessarily think is the best and ideal situation, in the circumstances they find themselves, it's better to put them in a location where services are well coordinated. So services from water and sanitation related services, education in those camps, nutrition services, child protection services, whereby addresses issue of psychosocial support, issue of family tracing and reunification, especially for children whose family might have separated from them, address issues of gender-based violence. So it's a mix of services provided by agencies, funds, programs, both national and international organizations. Now, I know you will say, well, it's been a long time providing these services to this group of people. Well, I don't think there is a timeline in how much or how long you want to help alleviate the situation. For as long as the insecurity exists, for as long as the conflict exists, there will always be people displaced, there will always be people requiring services, there will always be people requiring all those services that I highlighted. If you encamp them, you have to provide A, B, and C. And that is how far NGOs, UN agencies are going to help alleviate the situation. Of course, all of this is under the leadership of respective line ministries. And so you have all these Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development, and all those other ministries that addresses issues of this nature, because they are the umbrella we support and provide the needed assistance.
Okay, Kwame, let's go on a short break. When we return from the break, we will be looking at the deaths that have been recorded as a result of the direct, or what I call direct deaths from these conflicts. We'll look at it from 2010 down up to 2021 and see the figures, the undulating figures that are contained in this report. Let's go on the short break.
Nigeria of our dream, the Nigeria we need, is the united, indissoluble, and cohesive Nigeria which guarantees equity, fairness, justice, and prosperity for its citizens. That is our focus on people, politics, and power. It is fresh, insightful, impactful. It's a must-watch. People, politics, and power on AIT.
All right, thank you so much, and welcome back. Well, Mr. Kwame Mihere, let's take a look at the figures that have contained in this report. We talk of direct conflict-related deaths. And let's look at the years, 2010 to 2013. It was estimated about 2,000 persons, both adults and children, were killed per year. And then by 2014, it went up to as high as 8,000. 2015, it rose to 9,000. I want to believe this was at the height of the conflict itself. But by 2021, it had gone down to 3,000 killed as a result of direct conflict in that region. Now, not much is said between 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. What happened that period? Well, there are no figures for them.
There are, and I'll tell you. There are, but they are related to children. Because what the United Nations does when it comes to the office of the Secretary General and the SRSG managing the portfolio of children and armed conflict, the focus is to document death and maiming, recruitment and use of children, abductions, rape and other sexual violence, etc., related to children. And so you realize that between 2017 and 2021, our focus was just conflict-related death per children. That's where you have the 2,205. And like I said, these are only verified cases, and verified meaning through a mechanism called the monitoring and reporting mechanism of grave violations. So these figures that do not represent other deaths that have not been captured, either because of inaccessibility, because children are being killed, children are being maimed in locations where we are not able to access other armed groups, right? But if you realize, all these children, their deaths were recorded between this period, the period that you said there were no data. We might not have the data for adults. We might not have the data for adult men, adult women, etc., because that is not the mandate of UNICEF to put this figure and these statistics together, because our interventions are mainly directed at children. So whilst you find 2010, 2013 capturing all of this, these were periods before the monitoring and reporting mechanism came into force. Now, the monitoring and reporting mechanism directs that there has to be a system whereby children who have been killed, maimed, recruited and used, abducted, raped, and otherwise sexual violence, and whose services have been curtailed as a result of denial of humanitarian access to those locations, they need to be documented. And so if you go to the report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict, you see all of these things clearly outlined. and you get all the data for verified cases. And again, I underline the word verified cases because someone will say, how can you say only 2,000 children were killed and maimed in 4 years? It will be factually wrong. But if we say this number of children as a result of cases that have been verified and have been produced in a public report by the Secretary General of the United Nations, then you can quote it.
The question then is, when you talk of verification, who is the Secretary General's report relying on, or what did the Secretary General's report rely on? Did UNICEF, for instance, have people on ground that were gathering this information, or they were just mere estimates?
So these are not estimates, and it's not UNICEF. I want to also clarify that it's a mechanism under the UN system in any country where the situation that obtains in the Northeast exists, where there's conflict, and a conflict that has been listed by the Secretary General in his report. So in every country where this kind of mechanism is activated, there's what is called a country task force on monitoring and reporting, which is headed by the most senior UN official. So it's not a UNICEF alone. And now how this information is gathered, of course, there has to be a network. There has to be a network. There has to be all parties involved. There has to be social workers. It has to come from different factors. In fact, it will interest you to note that the media, you could put up a story that X number of children have been killed in Y location. It might serve as an alert. An alert in the sense that we don't just ignore this because it's coming from the media or because it's coming from AIT. But this is an alert that says, go to those locations or engage your contacts in those locations and try and do some triangulations to establish the facts. Because when I say verified cases, I mean verified. It goes through layers of verification. And it will never be released unless the most senior UN official in the country is certified or is satisfied that, yes, the verification process has been thorough. Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the whole issue of nutrition for children. Here you see, as of 2020, there was a 21.5% increase in child malnutrition. And then by 2021, a year later, 920,000 children were malnourished, and 300,000 children faced acute malnutrition. So there's been an increase, even though, as it were, the crisis, the intensity of the crisis was declining, but the level of malnutrition was on the rise.
That's an interesting analysis, and it's a call for action. Don't forget that nutrition in our parts of the world is also linked to access to our farmlands. And if we don't have access to our farmlands, and we are not able to produce and not able to sell and not able to use the markets, commerce in generally comes to more or less a standstill. It affects the intake, nutritional intake of children. But that also is also part of economics. If the economic livelihood of parents and caretakers and caregivers is also low, nutrition intakes also becomes a problem. And all of these, even though, yes, we say the intensity of the conflict might have reduced, but there are lots of other social structures or social issues that affect the statistics. Now, acute malnutrition at 300,000 children is huge. And it calls for a very strong, concerted effort by all to bring these numbers down. Because if these numbers are not brought down, what happens is that the next time we'll start recording not acute malnutrition, but we'll be recording deaths. And I think that will in itself not be a very positive outcome.
Does this in any way have to do with the fact that a lot of these people are unable to access their natural abodes? They are accommodated in IDP camps, and so the quality of food, the quality of livelihoods that they had in their various villages and towns is not available in the IDP camps, in spite of the fact that there is a lot of effort from government, from NGOs and other aid agencies that is directed at these people in the IDP camps.
Precisely so. You know, if we have to be honest with ourselves, I eat swallow almost every day, maybe with some fish and some chicken, etc. But for the average person displaced in the Northeast, first of all, the rations are not adequate to feed X number of households. Probably this is not what they are used to having when they are able to access their farmlands. You grow what you eat. You eat the quantity you want. You prepare it the way you want. Without conflict, trust me, these numbers will go down because people will be able to access their farmlands. They will be able to have the meals that they so desire. They will be able to eat at the time they want. And I think children's nutrition will be far, far better. Now, that is not to say the efforts that is being made by NGOs and the humanitarian community is not recognized. Imagine a situation where the little they have wasn't available. So it's like cushioning a situation. No one is trying to make you extremely comfortable in a camp setting because one, the resources are not there, but two, the numbers are just huge that no matter how much you pour into this, the camp setting, you're still just trying to keep heads above water, as we say. You're not trying to make a situation where the normal family settings, where even in the villages, they have access to their food, they have access to their milk, they have access to their proteins, their chicken, their goats, etc. It does not exist in the camp settings. But then also there is a little bit, you know, when it comes to children being acutely malnourished, I think one thing that UNICEF is trying to do is to help with breastfeeding. You know, and breastfeeding, it's exclusive breastfeeding, at least for 6 months, as they say. Most people in the camps do not practice this. Because first of all, the time to do that, they have to go look for firewood, they have to go look for what they can sell in the market to supplement what they get, you know. But it's a practice that UNICEF is pushing so hard to make sure that these numbers go down. Because you find that some of these things, they start from how a mother handles the baby from birth up to 6 months, and then the first 5 years, because those are the critical years. But like I said, it has to be a concerted effort, a concerted effort by all parties. Okay,
let's quickly come back to the whole issue of violations of children and others in this conflict zone. Your report indicates that between 2017 and 2021, 5,537 children were recruited by armed groups. And then further, I mean, much more than that, there were about 9,131 grave violations for that same period. Now, first is who were responsible for these violations? I ask that question against the backdrop of the fact that there have been reports and allegations by even Amnesty International that apart from the armed groups, there may be other institutions, even government institutions like the military and the JTF and the rest of them have been involved in one way or the others in these violations. Did your findings, your study, confirm any of this?
It's a very good question, and I'm very happy to answer this because it brings clarity to these numbers. 5,537 children recruited by armed groups. Again, these are verified figures. Could be more, way, way more. The armed groups in this context are parties to the conflict. So the parties to the conflict in Nigeria, JAZ and its affiliate groups, ISWAP, the security forces, the National Security Forces, so the National Army, and CJTF. Okay. If you look at these numbers, 5,537 between 2017 and 2021, this was primarily as a result of the huge number of children that were enlisted into the CJTF within that period. Of course, there were cases of children being recruited by other armed groups, JAZ. The word in itself is not just recruited, but recruited and used. So whilst you might not have a systematic policy of recruiting recruiting children, let's say in the case of the Nigeria Security Forces, there might be some rogue elements within the forces that will want to use children either at checkpoints to carry out menial jobs, say, hey, fetch me water, polish my shoe, go buy me cigarettes. So within the context of the monitoring mechanism, this qualifies as the use of children. Now, so recruitment of children by the Nigerian Security Forces, that one we have not documented, but we have documented instances of use of children. Maybe, let's say, out of 100 children, you'll find 2 or 3 children being used to carry out this. So the numbers have really dropped because there was an action plan that was signed between the United Nations through UNICEF and the CJTF to delist or disengage or release all those children that were within their ranks. And more than 2,000 children were released between 2019 and 2020. I mean, there was a huge, huge celebration within the communities, and that led to the CGTF being delisted. Now, when you are delisted, it doesn't mean you are not being monitored, because you can be delisted, but still a party. So the parties to the conflict were responsible. Now, grave violations, and I think I need to clarify this.
Yes, because I need to know, and my viewers also need to know what you mean by grave violations.
So grave violations within the context of the situation in Northeast Nigeria is, one, any violence that is directed at a child by a party to the conflict, and falls within the 6 parameters, and I'll explain that. So first is killing and maiming. Second is recruitment and use of children. Third, in no particular order. Third is abduction. 4 is rape and other forms of sexual violence. 5 will be attacks on schools and hospitals. 6 will be denial of humanitarian access. Now, if any of this happens in a place like Lagos, it will be a violation of children's rights. But it will not be documented under the monitoring and reporting mechanism to qualify as grave violations against children. So the location has to be specific. And it's unique in Nigeria because in other countries where there's an armed conflict, it's activated and it is countrywide. But because the conflict in Nigeria is localized in the northeast, grave violations are documented in Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe states. So one, it has to be within a conflict setting, a conflict that is being monitored, reported on by the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Arms Conflict. Two, it has to be carried out. That violation has to be carried out by a party to the conflict. Now, I highlighted the parties to the conflict. If a father maims a child in community X, that father is not a party to the conflict. That will be a violation of the child's rights, and you will expect the police, you will expect other law enforcement officials to address that
That will be categorized as domestic.
That could be categorized as domestic. That could also be categorized as a violence that has been carried out outside the domain of this mechanism that I'm talking about. So, a party to the conflict. So, in the case of Nigeria, you might find 9,131 grave violations, but out of that, recruitment and use of children alone is 5,000. So more than 50% of the violations were recruitment and use of children. Now, it doesn't mean that the more the violations, that's the more sensitivity attached to that violations. You could have just one child being sexually abused, and it's a huge, huge issue. So it's not really about the numbers, it's about the impact and the effects that these violations have on the children.
Okay, Mr. Kwame, I will let you go, but before I do that, I'll ask this last question. What more do you think the international community can do to help the situation in the Northeast?
I think what they can do is to increase resources. Increase resources, not just blindly, but resources that recipients are able to account for, resources that recipients are able to put into the actual use and purpose for which they have received those resources. Because over the years, a lot of money has been pumped into the region. But of course, first accountability to donors, but also accountability to the people. Because most times you're accountable to the one that gave you the money, but you don't feel that you're accountable to the one that you're providing the services to. So one, I think there has to be an increase in donor funds. But secondly, I think the state itself should be able to ensure that resource allocations to the line ministries that addresses issues of children, women, and all those things that we're talking about is also enhanced. So resources to the Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development, for instance, humanitarian affairs, for instance, should be stepped up.
All right, let's leave it at that. Mr. Patrick Kwame Amiere is the Child Protection Specialist at the UNICEF. Thank you so much for your time. We cannot exhaust everything about this report in a 1-hour program such as this, but we continue to engage with it one way or the other. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for
so
your
much.
time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's our program for today. People, Politics and Power. We return when we bring you a fresh edition of the program next week, Monday. Until then, thank you so much for investing your time with us, and do have a very wonderful time out there. Bye for now.